Well, hello, listeners. Welcome to Swords, Sorcery, and Synthesizers. My name's Ben Orchard. I'm coming to you from Adelaide.
And I'm Claire Fitzpatrick and coming to you from Brisbane.
And every now and then we talk over the phone about fantasy movies of the 80s. We look beyond the nostalgia to see what is the key to their enduring appeal. We have only 3 rules with regards to what we cover on this podcast. Number 1, it has to have been made in the 80s. Number 2, it has to have some kind of supernatural or fantastical element that defies rational explanation. And number 3, we have to both find it entertaining. Because we're not getting paid for this, are we, Claire?
Sadly not.
Life is too short to talk about boring movies.
Yes.
We hope you find it as entertaining to listen to us, talk about these movies as we did watching them. We've got a special guest on today's podcast. We've got Brian Craddock, a puppeteer and author, who is sort of associated with the film that we're talking about. We're talking about a Clive Barker film called Nightbreed. And Brian, you've actually written a short story that was published in an anthology of stories set in the same universe as this film, Midian Unmade.
Yes, Midian Unmade. I was trying to remember the title. That was published by Tor Books in 2015. Some of the authors in it were invited to partake in the project, and then the rest of us, there was a call out put on social media, and it was kind of a dogfight to try and get in. It was a very popular anthology, apparently, to submit to. They got thousands of submissions. And I've read some of those that were rejected, and they were really good. It's just unfortunate that we can't see more publications, in this universe.
So Brian and I have known each other for about 9 years,
Yeah.
9 years. And when I learned that he was in it, I was like, oh my God, that's so cool. That was sort of when I was sort of getting into my writing kind of, I wouldn't say writing career, but I was really into Clive Barker. I was looking into books about Nightbreed, and I came across this book, and I was like, I read his story, and we kind of fell in the same circle with Australian horror kind of community, and we both really like Nightbreed, so super keen to chat about it.
Well, for anyone who listening to this who doesn't know, Claire's also a published author, mainly specializing in horror fiction. I was actually have the dubious honor of introducing you to Clive Barker 20 years ago. I lent you a copy of a fantasy novel he wrote called Weave World, which actually my introduction to Clive Barker's fiction as well, which was sort of atypical because it's sort of an urban fantasy novel. It's not straight up horror exactly. Because Clive Barker's something of a Renaissance man. He's a novelist, he's a painter, he's a filmmaker. And actually the first film I saw of his was Lord of Illusions, which I would describe as a detective story with supernatural elements rather than straight up horror.
Yeah.
Then I saw Nightbreed, which is this weird sort of, I don't know, fantasy horror, urban crime hybrid. And then finally after that I saw Hellraiser, which is the film that he's best known for, funnily enough. I sort of started backwards. I started with all the obscure stuff that Clive Barker did, and then I became a fan of his horror fiction.
Well, I think Nightbreed is something that is really cool because I think even if people haven't watched it, you know about it, or at least have heard the title. Personally, it's actually not my favorite. I really like Aberrad. I love Aberrad books, but I found a connection to Nightbreed, a connection of these outsiders. And I really liked, like, despite some flaws, I'd say, in the movie, I think it was just highly original and just highly just interesting. And it really kind of cemented, I think, for me, Clive Barker's like really original ideas. And I love the fact that we're still talking about it all these years later.
He likes to say that he is a writer of the fantastic. He started as a horror writer because I think it was easy to sell. And then later he was able to kind of slowly migrate his work into more kind of a fantasy genre. So now I guess we sort of think of him as a sort of a dark fantasist. But that's why he did that, you know, and I think Cabal has earned its place in his writing as a kind of as the beginning of that kind of merging. You know, he did The Hellbound Heart, which then became the film Hellraiser. But with Cabal, you know, he was really moving away from the horror and into the fantasy. And then Weaveworld is kind of like, it's almost like a mature version of that book.
My favorite.
Cabal is it's a short book, it's a novella, and then Weaveworld is, you know, it's a novel length book exploring, I think, very sort of similar ideas. Instead of a cemetery, you've got a world that lives within the weeds of a rug. But it's still filled with fantastical kind of creatures and beings who fight with the authorities and with humankind. Or I think they call it the fear kind, don't they? Or is that the
that's Weaveworld.
that they're the citizens of Weaveworld. So I think I think for Nightbreed or as a book, Cabal, it was definitely Clive's foray or branching out and telling the world, look, I'm capable of more than just blood and guts and, you know, bone and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, like,
I was just about to say, you mentioned that Clive Barker's something of an ideas man. I forgot to mention that he was also a playwright. Like before he did all the other stuff that you mentioned, he was like running his own theater company. And
The Dog Company.
yeah, and well, with regards to his fiction, I call myself a fan, but the thing is, he is probably the most wildly uneven artist that I've ever followed in terms of like making a collection of his wider body of work and thinking like whenever he's got something new out, I have to check it out. But even so, oh Lord, honestly, I think that his material ranges from the sublime to the ridiculous. But the thing is, his ideas are always bold, and even when he swings and misses, like he's always swinging for the fences. He doesn't know how to phone it in, basically. Even when his projects are sort of lacking in the execution, they always have some like incredibly wild, crazy, wonderful idea at the center of it.
Sure, yeah.
So I think that's why I keep coming back. With regards to this specific project and its history, if I could just, you know, go into a bit of background detail for people who aren't familiar with it. This started out as a novella, Cabal, and I felt with the novella like it was an interesting story about this, you know, psychologically troubled man who's haunted by visions of an underground kingdom in a graveyard, and you know he goes to this psychologist who convinces him that, and he's having blackouts, and like his psychologist convinces him that, oh, you're having blackouts because you've got a, you know, multiple personality and you're a serial killer. But it turns out that the psychologist is actually a part-time serial killer and is setting him up for a crime, like framing him. So then he goes on the run, and then he finds the graveyard that's been in his dreams, and it's populated by ghouls, basically. And he sort of becomes, you know, bitten by one of them, and it sort of causes a transformation, and he becomes one of them. And then I guess it's revealed that he's sort of like a prophesied savior for these night creatures. And, you know, he ends up, you know, his footsteps are dogged by both the police and this, deranged psychologist who's, like, what's motivating him to be a serial killer is basically he's a kind of white supremacist character who's obsessed with perfection and, like, weeding out all the imperfect humans. And so you've got this monster story where sort of the humans are the real monsters.
So Ryan, yes,
And that,
like, what do you think about?
well, that was a very novel idea at the time, and I think
Yeah.
it's I think when we talk about Nightbreed as a film, and as a studio release, and we talk about it being a flop at the time, I think those ideas that Clive brought to the table are in part responsible for it. Anyone invested in knowing much about the film and its release also knows that the studio played a major hand in it being sort of received unfavorably. But I do really think that Clive came to the table with some ideas in the 80s that a lot of horror authors weren't doing at the time. And I think when we look at his body of work and we say it's somewhat inconsistent in its approach and its style, and I think that's why. I think he had explored what he needed to with the horror genre. He was ready to face the fantasy genre. He brought more elevated ideas to a genre that we all still thought was applicable, and that is the horror genre, when really I think it's Nightbreed sort of sits on the fence as to what it really is.
Yeah. Well, I actually, so I've spoken about how I consider myself a speculative fiction author. And I think even though people kind of might think of Nightbreed as horror, I think it's speculative. Because there's so many elements of it. It has it does have the horror, it does have the fantastical elements, it has like the monsters or who are human, like they're the good guys. They just happen to look monstrous. And I really like that aspect of the grotesque, the macabre, the carnivalesque kind of thing.
And Clive does too, and he uses that as a gateway to these ideas. He wants us to explore the ideas, and he sweetens the deal by giving us monsters.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that Cabal and the film adaptation Nightbreed are really sort of explorations of prejudice and how
Yeah.
we turn people that we don't understand, like subcultures and minority communities, how we turn them into an other. And it's sort of presented through this sort of dark fantasy horror allegory. I think that comes through better in the novella than the film. I have mixed feelings about all of the incarnations of this story that have been made over the years. I was saying to Claire in a previous episode about the differences between cult classics and regular classics, the different types of cult classics. I said to Claire that when people talk about, like, respected classics like The Godfather, they wax lyrical about how it's as close to perfection as a human artistic endeavor can possibly be. Whereas when you look at a cult classic like Nightbreed, a lot of the time it is very flawed, but it's those very flaws that people look upon with affection. Like the following that it has, a lot of people love it because of those flaws as much as in spite of them. The other thing that I was going to say, and that I said in a previous episode about the film Legend, is that different films become cult classics for different reasons. Some of them become cult classics because they're, secretly awesome, just didn't reach a wide audience because they weren't marketed properly or something. Others become cult classics because they're so bad they're good. But then there's a third type which I call the almost there movie, where like all of the elements seem to be in place for a really great movie. But for whatever reason, it just doesn't, come together. The whole is less than the sum of its parts. But those parts are often strikingly brilliant. And
you would say Nightbreed is exemplifies this?
yes, I would say Nightbreed is almost there. It has so many strikingly brilliant parts, even though I don't think it really comes together in any of the versions. I feel that when I read the novella Cabal, I feel like I'm reading the first installment of a trilogy that never got finished.
Yeah.
It's a page turner, and it has this really awesome, intriguing mythology to it, but then it doesn't really have a proper finale. It just sort of ends on a cliffhanger. Then there's the film adaptation, which is unusual in that you've got Clive Barker, the novelist, actually writing and directing an adaptation of his own work. That's unusual. The original theatrical cut was sort of had so much footage cut out of it and sort of reshoots forced upon Clive Barker by the studio to make it more commercial that it's sort of like a bit of a mess. It's barely coherent. Then there's the director's cut, which pretty much has the same problem as the novel, I would say, in that it's great and everything up to a point, but then it just sort of fizzles out, if you know what I mean. And there was a comic book series put out by Boom Studios that tried to sort of wrap it all up, tie up all the loose ends.
Mm.
And it's okay, but the thing is, like, they planned a much longer print run. And about halfway through the publication, the publishers said, "Oh, this isn't selling. You're gonna have to, like, cut the print run in half. We can only do so many issues." So they had to sort of rewrite the ending, and yeah, the ending is a bit rushed, put it that way.
These kind of like extra kind of additions to films that is sort of like the how continuing like the story afterwards. It made me also think about like the Midian Unmade book that you're in. Do you think that's something that like in books and films based on kind of authors like Clive Barker, where it just again like as Ben was saying, not quite there. I personally think that it's amazing that the creative people can kind of take those ideas and just run with it. And Clive, we don't know what he thinks, but he's, hasn't said don't do that. I'm not sure.
Clive quite likes it.
Yeah.
There is a history of some authors like H.P. Lovecraft
Yeah.
saying, take my work and do something with it. Within reason, Clive is really happy with that. Also, the actors that portrayed those characters, they're quite happy to see those too.
Oh, okay. Are you talking about, like, Craig Sheffer and Anne Bobby and David Cronenberg?
No, I'm talking about Nicholas Vince Berman. So
Okay.
he played Kinski. He also played Chatterer in the Hellraiser series. So there was actually an earlier run of comics than the Boom Studio stuff, and that was done by Marvel back in the 90s under the Epic series. So Epic Comics did, I think it was a run of about 18 Nightbreed comics. And Nicholas, who, as I said, played Kinski in the Nightbreed film, he wrote, I think, three of those books. One of the stories that he wrote was actually two books. It was a story called Mad God Baphomet, and it focused on Laurie and Kushner Day. At some point in Nightbreed the film, I'm just trying to remember what I think it's when Laurie gets attacked in the cemetery. She faints because Narcisse, he doesn't attack her, but I think that's right. Decca's running after her, and she runs to the cemetery, and then she faints because of Narcisse. And I think it's that scene. I'm not sure, but there's like drums drumming along to Decca chasing Laurie. It's like heart pounding stuff, and the camera pans down through the ground, and it shows this sort of pig-faced man banging on the walls with his hands, and he stops. That character called that's Kushner Day, and so Nicholas Vince Berman, he wrote this two-part series for Epic Comics called Mad God Baphomet about Kushner Day and Laurie, and it's a brilliant story arc. And so he said it was actually his first foray into comics. And as a little tidbit, he got into that because when they were filming a deleted scene for Nightbreed, it's the scene where Anne Bobby is singing in the bar.
Club, yeah.
Nicholas plays a cowboy extra in the crowd. He said on Facebook that they were having a conversation that led to him pursuing Marvel Comics and becoming a comic book writer. And so he got included in the Epic comic run to run that story, Mad God Baphomet. And I think it's really cool that the actors themselves ended up kind of, extending out into that universe as well and sort of contributing to it. And Clive's very happy with that.
Yeah, I think probably one reason I love Nightbreed and I keep coming back to it is it has served as sort of like a springboard for this whole other realm of creativity across different mediums. There's a metal band, Cradle of Filth, that did an album, Midian, as well. There was sort of a concept album inspired by Nightbreed.
I was actually like a bit of a fan of them when I was like teenage years, how you kind of get into an alternative thing. But I actually think it's quite beautiful. Like I think so melodic, and I listened to that as a teenager, and I didn't realize that it was connected to Nightbreed until I read about and watched the film. Then I was like, oh my god, how did I not make the connection?
Well, Danny Filth is English, isn't he?
Yeah, he is.
So I imagine he grew up probably, well, he would have grown alongside Clive. I get their careers kind of evolved at the same time.
Well, yeah, just to clarify, Clive Barker's from Liverpool originally. In his younger days, like if you squinted and, like you could kind of, mistake him for Paul McCartney.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I'll look at it again. Have you heard Danny Phil speak?
Yes.
Oh my god, it is the weirdest voice. He do, but it's just so weird.
So are we saying, just to expand on that Beatles theory that Paul McCartney was swapped out or killed, are we saying that Clive Barker and Paul McCartney swapped?
Yes.
That would be interesting. That'd be interesting. But getting back to Nightbreed, the film, for a moment, I'd like to talk more about like the reasons I keep coming back to it, why I think, even though it's almost there, I tend to look at it as like a glass half full situation. And I just sort of savor that, glass of, I don't know, red liquid or something. I think there's a whole lot of different reasons for it. I mean, you've hinted at them already. The film is just visually, it's a feast for the eyes. The way that, Barker plays with light and darkness in a literal sense with the visuals and the cinematography, the production design for the cemetery and the sort of underground kingdom of the night creatures is just, yeah, it's mind-boggling. Just the tiny, like the attention to tiny details in the sets and the props and the costumes and the makeup and practical effects. The makeup is just so uncanny. Where you see all these creatures that are sort of inhuman, and you see like these prosthetics that are put on them to make them look strange and otherworldly, and they really do. And also there's like it's a feast for the ears as well. There's Danny Elfman's score, which has this sort of, I don't know, militaristic tone for the action sequences. That is, unlike what he usually does. You mentioned that in the director's cut, the hero's girlfriend, Laurie, is shown to be a cabaret singer. Anyone who's a fan of Broadway musicals might have heard of Anne Bobby, who plays the character. She's very active in musical theater. That's probably what she's best known for. And she is a great singer. And she did a great cover of the song, I think, Johnny Get Mad, in the director's cut, which I'm glad is back in. And she's very endearing. Like she's blends vulnerability and strength in the part, I think.
Yeah, well, Brian, you mentioned Anne Bobby before, like earlier, and her like involvement in like me on my age.
Yeah, well, no, and I don't think she had much to do with Midian Unmade, the book, but she definitely did help with this restoration, the director's cut and the Kyle cut. She was instrumental in pushing a movement called the Occupy Midian movement. It was started by four guys, primarily Jose and Ryan. They started up essentially an online petition through Facebook called Occupy Midian to try and convince Morgan Creek that it was worth putting a few dollars into tracking down the lost footage and doing a director's cut. And Bobby was tweeting out support for this movement, and that's when it really gained traction. I think she mentioned it in an interview with, I don't know if it was like Fangoria or Horror Hound or something like that. But that's when it really exploded, and eventually the studios were convinced to try and put a bit of money into it. And obviously Mark Miller had been given the green light by Clive Barker to go and seek out the footage. The footage was apparently lost in the vaults of Fox Studios somewhere, and either for compliance reasons or contractual or financial or whatever, no one was looking for the footage. The theory was really that no one wanted to see a restoration of this film.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I think the studio will only act in terms of like getting a director's cut out there if they think they can make a buck on it, get a return on their investment.
When we spoke about Legend, how there was a director's cut and they had, different like score and the version with Tangerine Dream. It seems and we're talking about how films like this can divide fans. So either fans really love it or really hate it for some obscure reason.
I think with Nightbreed, most fans who have seen the director's cut and the theatrical cut prefer the director's cut, though. I don't think there's a real divide amongst fans in terms of, like with Legend, where there's this sort of rivalry between people who prefer the US theatrical cut and the Tangerine Dream score that it has, and people who prefer the director's cut with the Jerry Goldsmith score. Also, like, there are some musical differences, but they aren't very large between the two cuts, and it's Danny Elfman doing both. I think most people, they think of the director's cut as like the fully realized version, or about as close as you're gonna get, really. Which I guess sort of brings me to, like, I want to just finish up on just listing the things I like about it, and then like you guys can have at it. But I was just going to say, with regards to other things I like about it, I really love the performance of David Cronenberg as the villain. He's better known as a director, things like, Scanners, The Fly, Dead Ringers, A History of Violence, or A Dangerous Method, among many other films. But he also has like a sideline as a character actor, which a lot of people don't know. I was particularly impressed with his performance in the Netflix adaptation of Margaret Atwood's novel, Alias Grace, where he played like a benevolent priest, which is a role that like a lot of people probably wouldn't have expected of him. Whereas his role in Nightbreed is probably the most sizable role he's ever had as an actor, and he is portraying a white supremacist psychopath. I was just going to say, like, he's crazy, but he also has a kind of suave, dapper charm to him when when the character is out in public, and like he presents this, sophisticated image. I guess he puts on this mask of a scarecrow when he goes out killing people and carrying out what he sees as his purification mission. And then it's like his true self actually comes to the fore when he puts on the mask. Like, whenever he's on screen, you pay attention. He's just a riveting villain. I wish I could say the same about the film's hero, played by Craig Sheffer. I watched a making of documentary with him, where he said in the interview that he was like, this isn't me describing his performance, this is him describing his performance. He said that
Oh my god, yep, I know what you're gonna say.
he said that he spent much of the film doing a bad James Dean impersonation. And yeah, he did. Although, in an odd way, I find his sort of goofball demeanor kind of compelling in its own way. Maybe not. It's amusing, maybe not intentionally so, because he's doing this like goofball James Dean shtick. Like, any of the scenes where the other characters are like saying, "Oh, you're the prophesied chosen one," are just so hilarious. It's just, there's nothing like it. Like, I can't think of it. It's like so far removed from the typical formula of a horror movie or a typical like fantasy movie. It's just so out there. I can't, like, even if it swings and misses, I can't help but respect it just for its audacity and originality.
Is that sort of what you kind of like about it, Brian? Like, in our discussions where we've spoken about it, we have that mutual love of it, I guess. So, yeah.
Yeah, that, and Ben touched on before about, it appeals to the sense of other.
Yeah.
I think that was its popularity back in the day. There was a bunch of, goth kids or artists or people living in rural backward towns who just thought, I'm a little different. And Clive is, it's no secret that he's gay, and that the film has that kind of allegory behind it as well. But when you say, Ben, that the film, it was something of, different for its day, I think that was largely its popularity as well, is that, in the 80s, they could make a film like this and take a loss. These days, studios are sort of not willing to do that. It's become a lot more cutthroat financially. And I think I would like to say that a film like this they wouldn't chance it today, but that's not actually entirely true. Nightbreed as a film, at least from the studio perspective, has actually paved the way. So at the time, it was a risk because you didn't make a film where the monsters were kind of, sympathetic and that the human characters, particularly the police force, were kind of the bad guys. But now that's quite popular to do. And we also have a slew of not just films, but, TV shows, everything from, the Vampire Diaries onwards, where monsters are the central kind of characters, and are sometimes sympathetic, etc. But that sort of wasn't really done in the 80s. It wasn't a big thing. So the film Nightbreed was new and it was exciting at the time, and it kind of set the tone for something that was going to come much later. And it took Clive to do that, but he had to fight the studio. The studio itself couldn't understand that vision, and they marketed it as a slasher film.
So not.
And apparently the original trailer, which I've never seen, but the original kind of TV release trailers and whatnot, they didn't even show the monsters at all. They just showed kind of Laurie and Decker and probably Boone for all I know, but it gets talked a lot about that Laurie and Decker were sort of selling this slasher film. And the original posters did that as well. They were just Laurie's eyes, and they talked about, the shocking film. And Clive was very against that, not just from a marketing point of view, because it didn't represent the film. But creatively, he was against that. That's kind of these days when I'm like on social media and I see people doing cosplays of Decker, and I think that's great. But where are the cosplays of Pelican? He's more interesting to me.
Well, here's the thing. I don't think that's so much a case of them not liking the characters or not appreciating them. I think it's just that it's much more difficult to do. Like, I remember when Peter Capaldi was cast as Doctor Who, and he had a much sort of plainer costume than his predecessors. And my original thought was, well, I guess I'll see a lot more people cosplaying as his Doctor now, just because it'll be a lot easier. And
get creative, buddies. Get creative and make paper mache.
Certainly it's easier than cosplaying as the Sixth Doctor, Colin Baker, if you've ever seen his costume. But in any case, yeah, I think it's probably just that it's easier to put together a Decker costume. That's the name of David Cronenberg's character, just because it's just like
you just pull a mask on and you're done, totally.
You get like a suit, bench coat, and a mask made of sacking, and
I definitely think that is one argument to make, but I also think that so recently I saw a thread on Reddit where someone was asking, what's the big deal about Nightbreed? I don't get it. And there was a sort of an argument going on in the comments. And reading through it, it occurred to me that if you are a horror aficionado and you approach Nightbreed with only that mindset, you may be disappointed because of those elements that quite often fans like myself, find endearing. And I do think that there is a contingent of, and I'm going to call it just horror fans, and as opposed to just film fans, horror fans that like the character of Decker, and because it reads to them, they know the serial killer kind of trope, and they go with it. But
also he has some similarities to the Batman villain Scarecrow.
True.
I think there's a crossover there too, but go on.
I think there's a crossover to a lot of like masked characters, Jason, Michael Myers. It's the faceless kind of hidden psychopath that kind of kill you. Clive did that deliberately. He wanted that character to actually represent that trope in horror. And he wasn't doing it to, criticize it or make fun of it, but he is critical of that that style of villain in horror films. They don't appeal to him at all. He doesn't find any intellectual value in them.
I don't like them either. But
with Decker, what he did was he took that trope and he gave it something else. And Ben, you've extrapolated on, the intentions behind Decker, the purification and whatnot. And I think sometimes that gets missed by not just fans of Nightbreed, but quite often just horror fans, is that this is a really complex character. Like, at face value, he's just a serial killer. Like, and then we've got the duality of him being a psychologist, which is kind of funny. But his reason for killing is that he doesn't like the fact, and breeders in particular is his issue. This issue gets explored a lot more in the novella than it does in the film, or at least it's kind of easy to understand. He doesn't like breeders, which are families, because families keep producing yet another human being who doesn't live up to his standards, who isn't like him.
Yeah.
And that's Decker's whole problem, is that he doesn't like anything that's not like him. And the Nightbreed actually represent the absolute opposite of himself.
Then I was gonna say, so you and I both have epilepsy, and I think that's one of the reasons that I really liked Nightbreed and like Cabal, because I felt like, the other. So like, do you feel like a personal connection, I guess, of being like the other? And we've mentioned like they're kind of scary, but they're not like serial killers. They're not yeah, they look scary, they look like horror villains, but they're not. They're not like
The breed themselves.
yeah, the breed themselves. So yeah, Ben, what do you think about like, I guess, the internal versus external? So like how they are on the inside and how they are perceived on the outside. Sort of like how you and I have epilepsy.
There were some aspects to the main character Boone I identified with. He has the
Hmm.
blackouts and memory loss, and that's part of why the psychologist Decker can manipulate him so easily. When
Yeah.
I have epileptic seizures, it does affect my memory. I don't clearly remember everything that happens when I'm having a seizure.
Yeah.
The fact that he struggles to sort of hold down a regular job and fit in
That's us.
and fit into society. He has sort of some socially awkward mannerisms. Like that is sort of stuff that I can relate to. Especially when I was a teenager, when I was younger, I didn't really fit in. I didn't have quite as much difficulty fitting in as he does, but I could relate. And in a way, it was comforting to like read this story and sort of think, because I think I first read it when I was a teenager, and I could think, oh, someone has it worse than I do. But as for what you were saying about the characters' internal lives, I think Brian, you touched upon something here about the characters' intentions. Every character in this film, the way that the actors portray them, like they all think of themselves as the heroes of their own story. And even the villains, like even Decker imagines himself on this like righteous crusade. He is the hero of the story as far as he's concerned. And the redneck cops that Decker enlists to help him and like lead a posse against the Nightbreed, like they're racist bigots, but they think that they're doing right by America and everything. Like and like there's this character that just has a minor role in the novella and the film, but becomes something more prominent in the comic books. This priest who's basically a religious fundamentalist, and he's crazy, and he becomes a serial killer as well in the comics. But he also thinks of himself as like one of the good guys. He thinks of himself as a righteous man.
It's an important point, actually, because I think it's the appeal of Clive Barker is that he understands that psychology about people, that no one really walks around thinking of themselves as the bad guy in any story. It makes, maybe not necessarily for complex characters, but definitely more rounded characters. And I think as a viewer, you pick up on it. You haven't got just a bad guy and just a good guy here. You've got shades of.
Shades of grey, which I think is why I kind of, like films like this, because I think also with a lot of Clive Barker characters, they're either not good or not bad. I think people make choices that could perhaps be not the best, but their intentions are always sincere, I think. Or if they make really bad choices, then their intentions are bad, but maybe in their mind, with Decker, they don't think that's true, and they think that everyone else is the other. Maybe like that's sort of what I got from his character, that he thinks he's right and righteous, and everyone else is wrong.
On a little tangent here, Decker, his full name is Philip K. Decker.
Philip K. Dick.
Yeah. It's a believe it or not, there's a few science fiction kind of what should I put it? Let's say tie-ins. No, not tie-ins. That's the wrong phrase. But there's a few things that sort of I could point to in Nightbreed that are science fiction related. So you've got Decker's name.
Well, can I say something about Decker before you?
Oh, yes, go for it.
I'd just like to say that Decker's game is like gaslighting people and, manipulating people into seeing a different view of reality. And it's fitting that he's named after Philip K. Dick, because a recurring theme in his fiction was like, people's perception of reality being manipulated or delusional, and people realizing the world around them is not what it seems. And
I wonder if that's why he chose that name then.
Yeah, clearly that's a theme in Clive Barker's books and stories.
Anyway, I interrupted you, Brian. You can.
Oh yes,
sorry.
I was going to use use it as a segue to sort of point out that one of the families that Decker kills early in the film, the father of that family, he is from Red Dwarf. Anyone who's familiar with Red Dwarf would recognize him as, I think it's Captain Hollister. When we talk about, the appeal of the film, its cult appeal, and we talk about the flaws in the film, for me, one of the things that I like about flawed films, or rather the flaws in some films, are things like matte paintings. When I know there's a matte painting, for some reason I've really liked the film more. There's a few matte paintings that are used in Nightbreed, and I think they're sort of fairly obvious, of the necropolis. So when Boone and Laurie first go to Midian, each on their own, we see vistas of the cemetery that is above where the Nightbreed live, and that's clearly a matte painting. And then there's obviously the mural that the film begins with. So you get Danny Elfman's beautiful sort of almost lyrical lullaby score at the beginning, and we get this very slow pan across a mural on a wall, and it's the history of the Nightbreed. We can see like a tree, a black and white tree, with figures all sitting in the branches. One is humanity, one is the Nightbreed. So it's sort of suggesting that, we come from shared kind of roots. Again, anyone who's not that familiar with the film, to explain the Nightbreed, they're kind of a collection of misfits: demons, monsters, vampires, werewolves, anything from our collective kind of mythology.
Yeah, I sort of described them as ghouls earlier.
Yeah.
Probably how it's different from anything else. They're not really like there's a one-to-one comparison with any of the things.
No, they're bit as there are stars. That's how Clive wanted to put it. And to that end, the makeup department, so that was Jeff Portis and Bob Keane at Image Animation in England, they were tasked with coming up with an extra 100 monsters halfway through production.
What?
Yeah. Clive realized, hang on, we need more creatures in the background, and I don't want to keep reusing the same ones. So they just had to do weird makeup scenarios, use whatever was at hand, and just kind of come up with creatures, like 100 of them.
That just makes me think of in Lord of the Rings, how most of the writers, like the fighters, they're all women.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, because they're like, oh, we wouldn't have enough.
We're running out of people.
We're running out. Let's get a bunch of women, and they were like professional horse riders.
And if you think about it, 100 different monsters, right? So that's a different species of monster. And, in the mythology of humankind, we've probably got that many. But to have them in a film, on location, 100, that's 100 plus monsters. There's probably never been a film that's ever had such a variety of monsters before. And that leads me into what Clive Barker was saying at the time. I think in October 1989, he did a Fangoria magazine interview that's become, I think, famous. And he said, I want Nightbreed to be the Star Wars of monster movies. And what's interesting about that is that the opening mural with the Nightbreed history that leads up to the dog-headed man, I can't remember his name now, that and the necropolis scenes were painted by Ralph McQuarrie. And Ralph McQuarrie is famous for being the concept artist behind the original Star Wars trilogy. He designed Chewbacca and R2-D2 and all that sort of stuff. And Clive said, I want the best of the best working on Nightbreed. So he'd done Hellraiser as a very low-budget film, and he wanted Nightbreed to be his his opus at the time.
Well, then I was just gonna touch on how we spoke about Ridley Scott and what's his brother's name?
Tony Scott.
Yeah, so how I guess Ridley Scott had, a much more elaborate, more money, more better production, where Tony Scott kind of didn't. And I think he mentioned,
I would disagree with that, Claire. I would just say I disagree. I don't think that they both made very expensive blockbuster movies over the years. I just think it's that Tony Scott tended to gravitate towards more contemporary settings generally, whereas a lot of the time Ridley Scott did either period films or films that are set in the future or outer space or something
yeah,
that is set in these sort of more exotic, out of the way places. So, I mean, whereas, like, yes, you see a movie like Alien or Blade Runner or Gladiator, and you see, it's obviously expensive to make, like, recreating this world. But I'm sure that a lot of, like, Tony Scott's films, like Top Gun and Crimson Tide and, like, various other, like, action blockbusters he did over the years were probably quite expensive to make too.
yeah. Well, that's what I was kind of touching on as like the expense of things and the budget of things, and then I guess the really good directors they
I
do
suppose
what they can.
you're probably right in that if you try to, like, build a whole world from the ground up, it's gonna cost you.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Whereas if you try to just, like, incorporate fantasy elements into, like, the real world, it's probably, not going to be such a risk. I mean, I guess the Scott brothers, the two films that we covered by them were The Hunger and Legend, both of which, didn't do very well at the box office, but they became cult classics. But I guess The Hunger was, like, slightly more successful at the time because it was like a contemporary piece with fantasy elements, whereas Legend was, as you say, building a whole world from the ground up.
And The Hunger is amazing, and no one can disagree with me.
Okay. I'm not gonna argue.
I mean, Vic Smith's makeup alone, right?
So good. As you mentioned in an episode about it, just visually, like as you were saying, just so beautiful. Like, yes, there are flaws that going to defend it, just like you say, Ben, how you're gonna defend like other films in like the 80s.
Well, put it this way. I was surprised that you didn't like Legend because it seems to me that all the flaws it has are present in Nightbreed as well, and that's a film that you love. I was just going to say that, getting back to the subject of Nightbreed, now we've gone off on that tangent. You're right, Brian, about have all of this stuff being packed into a frame. Like, a lot of the stuff that you mentioned, this diversity of monsters, some of it's like only visible for like 10 seconds or something. And you notice some of these things you miss on the first viewing, but you pick it up on repeat viewings. And that's sort of like another reason why I've kept coming back to the film time and time again over the years, is that even though I know the basic story, the broad strokes of it off by heart, the details still often take me by surprise with each viewing of it.
It's crazy that studio was willing to invest so much. I mean, doing it in England, obviously they were able to cut a lot of costs. I think they did shoot parts in Canada, if I recall, because I think it's set in Canada. They don't say it is.
I think it is.
They don't say it is. Like they say, I think, but they've got maple leaves on the columns. I think Boone has a Canadian passport at some point. Some of the things that they had to do to get the shots. I heard a story a long time ago from one of the crew members that they were really angry actually with some of the Midian scenes because Clive was still a pretty inexperienced director at that stage. It was his second film, but yeah, he sort of I think he didn't have a lot of either know-how or control on some of the Midian sets, and they said that it filled up with smoke machines and was it just a health hazard. People were like choking. There's so much messed around, but I have dabbled in special effects makeup in my time, and consequently I have a lot of friends on Facebook who are makeup artists, and a lot of them have worked on Nightbreed. Robbie Drake, that's right, Robbie Drake. He was a foam technician on Nightbreed. He was only young at the time, I believe. He also acted in it as a berserker for the pickup shots, and he was also a character called the Thrall, who was in the film, the Thrall appears for, I think, all of 5 seconds when Laurie is looking for Boone in Midian, and Midian's about to burn. And it's just before she comes across Pelican, and, and he kind of takes her butterfly pin and sticks it in his chest. As she's walking down one of the corridors, there's a character that appears to be covered in tumors, and just his face is visible, and he's rocking backwards and forwards.
Yeah, that kind of creeped me out.
So that character is called the Thrall, and that actor was Robbie Drake, who was actually a foam technician. So a lot of the crew actually stood in as extras in the film to get the abundance of people either in Anne Bobby's scene singing or, in Midian as the monsters. Yeah, Robbie Drake, he actually posted his contract on Facebook. He found his old Nightbreed contract, and it refers to the film as Nightbreed 1, because obviously back then they were talking about doing a trilogy.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because Clive doesn't like to do sequels, but he was willing to do 3 Nightbreed films, thinking that, he could look at more of these monsters. Yeah, I do sort of wonder about whether or not the Nightbreed as a trilogy would have even worked.
I think it'd be cool, but I think also it's really great as standalone
Well,
well.
that's an interesting take on it. Like I said, to me, well, I already said it. I already said that to me, every version of this story feels unfinished. I don't think that any one of them really works as a standalone piece.
Well, I like it as a standalone piece, but I do agree, as we were saying, it does sort of end, and it would be great. It's great that they have it's continued as well. But I think also that maybe it's just not the best. But again, that's just my personal opinion. No, yeah.
No, it's okay. I mean, I understand where you're coming from. I think there are a lot of things that failed to take off and just remained these small cult favorites. I tend to try and take a philosophical view of things with a lot of cult favorites that didn't take off and didn't become long-running franchises, even if they were designed to be. I'm thinking of the TV series Firefly, which I really liked, that only lasted for 1 season and had a spin-off movie that didn't do well at the box office either. But I liked the story that existed up to that point. And I'm thinking, at least it couldn't run out of steam. It couldn't jump the shark just because it didn't, endure for a long time. I should just count my blessings then. And I'm kind of, over the years, I'm thinking, well, maybe Nightbreed feels unfinished. Maybe it's incomplete. Maybe it's a glass half full. But just to, count your blessings, appreciate what you've got, and as Voltaire said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny you bring this up, actually, because I just remembered Nightbreed nearly did make it as a TV series recently. Yeah. Michael Plumides, he's from North Carolina. He was scripting it, and he was working on it for several years. And I think, the last time he mentioned it on Facebook was about 2020, I think in the Occupied Midian group. On his own page, I think around about 2014, 2015 was when he was really developing it. And eventually the project, I think, got taken off him, and he's turning all the material into a graphic novel called Nocturnity. But he did say at some point on his Facebook that Michael Dougherty from Trick or Treat, I'm not familiar with the film, but the director of that was now attached to Nightbreed, the TV series. But he thinks that one of the reasons that we haven't heard about it recently is because the production wanted to sell it to a streaming service, and they haven't really found one. Had it just stayed as the traditional, we probably would have seen a TV show by now. But yeah, they were developing it.
Yeah. Well, just to wrap up, I was going to ask both of you. So, Ben and Brian, if we could go into the future, how would you like Nightbreed or Cabal to be adapted?
You mean
if it was adapted again? If it was done, if it was a reboot, for both of you, just think a series, a mini-series. Okay, personally, I'd love a mini-series, but then Brian.
A mini-series would be good, but with a lot of cult stuff, it's missed its zeitgeist. It's paved the way for other stuff, and I think for it to be remade now, we would have to touch on, again, the sense of other, but touch on make it sort of topical, relevant today.
Like I Can Dream. What I would like is an animated TV series.
Or my god.
And I would like.
Yeah.
I feel that a lot of the fantastical things would be easier to achieve on a lower budget in the medium of animation than they would be with live action film.
Yeah.
I have actually drawn a few characters as a cartoon versions.
I would actually love a Studio Ghibli version of Apparat. Just as a side note, I think that would be beautiful. So cool.
Yeah, I mean, I know that Japanese anime, they tend to take risks in terms of like making more animation geared towards adults than like Western animation studios do.
Yeah.
But even so, that's like my main reasoning for like an animated TV series. If it was a TV series, then you wouldn't have the problem of length, of trying to like cram too much into a short runtime, which is sort of the problem that the movie faced in terms of like packing all this mythology, packing all these monsters into one frame. And a TV series would give the story space to breathe. And if it's animation, it could be done on a lower budget and still look good, I think.
Well, Brian, thanks for coming along and having a chat with us. And it's really cool that I think all three of us like it, like Nightbreed and Cabal for different reasons. I think still like shared reasons, but I think all of us have, a nuance, and all of us have experienced the feeling of feeling like the other. I think feeling like we're on the fringes of society. And I think that's why all of us, and a lot of people as well, fans, just really love it and just really return to it, even though they have flaws, as we've pointed out, but it's just so good. It's so good. And yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you again.
It's been fun talking to both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Claire.
That's all for this week, folks. Thanks for listening. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing and sharing this podcast with your friends. If you have any questions or would like to provide suggestions for future episodes, you can send an email to fantasypodcastfeedback@gmail.com. Until next time, cheers.